France, 1774. A world where nobility and peasantry exist in separate universes, where fortunes are determined by birth, where destiny sometimes defies all expectations. In the misty dawn of a forgotten morning, fate wove a tapestry of the most unlikely threads. Broken girl with nothing but shame clutched to her chest, and a nobleman whose heart had been sealed behind walls of grief and solitude. Their worlds were never meant to touch, yet when they collided, the very foundations of propriety and social order began to crumble. What started as an act of casual mercy, a widowed Marquis bringing an abandoned peasant girl to his mansion, ignited a sequence of events that would scandalize the aristocracy, challenge ancient traditions, and perhaps unlock the impossible. The story I'm about to share with you reveals how a single decision, made in a fleeting moment of compassion, unleashed a cascade of forbidden emotion, dangerous desire, and heart-wrenching sacrifice. It exposes how the divisions we create between people, divisions of class, wealth, and status, can dissolve like morning mist when faced with something far more powerful. And it unveils how deeply buried within the human heart lies the capacity for transformation. Even in the most rigid of souls, this tale of unexpected connection will force you to question everything you thought you knew about love, power, and the invisible threads that bind us all. It will transport you to a world where every glance across a candlelit room carries the weight of unspoken longing, where every touch risks everything, and where true belonging is worth any price. Before this story unfolds completely, I invite you to become part of our storytelling community. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you never miss the next chapter in our collection of untold histories and forgotten romances. Leave a like if you feel the stirrings of anticipation already coursing through you. Share this journey with others who appreciate the beauty of unexpected connections. And save this video to return to whenever you need to be reminded that sometimes the most powerful stories are those that begin with a simple act of mercy. Now, settle in and allow me to transport you to the misty countryside of Bordeaux, where our story begins. The dawn crept reluctantly over the vineyards of Bordeaux, spilling pale gold across the morning mist that clung to the earth like a lover's embrace. The Kingdom of France in 1774 was a land of stark contrasts, opulent chateaus rising from seas of desperate poverty, silk-clad nobility stepping over masses of the hungry and forgotten. In this world of absolute division, Annette Moreau walked alone, her bare feet collecting the dust of a road that led nowhere and everywhere at once. Her dark hair, once praised for its luster, now hung in matted tangles around her hollow face. The tattered remains of her dress, once a modest but respectable garment, now exposed, scratched knees, and told silent stories of her fall from grace. Each step she took sent shooting pain through her blistered feet, yet she continued forward, driven by the visceral need to put distance between herself and the shame that pursued her like a vengeful shadow. The accusations still rang in her ears with merciless clarity: thief, liar, worthless girl, words that had been thrown at her with such conviction that they had begun to seep into her bones, becoming a poison that threatened to transform her understanding of herself. She had not taken the golden reliquary, had not even touched the precious heirloom that had gone missing from Madame Russell's chambers. But in a world where a peasant girl's word meant nothing against that of her employers, truth had become a luxury she could not afford. The memory of her dismissal burned like acid in her mind, the circle of servants watching her humiliation with a mixture of pity and relief that it was she, not they, who had been selected as sacrifice. No investigation had been conducted, no questions asked. Her guilt had been determined the moment the valuable piece had been discovered missing. Her fate sealed by nothing more than her unfortunate position at the bottom of an unforgiving social hierarchy. The night had passed in a blur of numbness and cold. Her body curled beneath the dubious shelter of an abandoned shed, her empty stomach no longer even capable of producing hunger pangs. Now, as morning broke, Annette continued her aimless journey, each step heavier than the last, her consciousness beginning to fragment like ice on a spring river. She had no destination, no hope of sanctuary. Her parents had died years ago, victims of the fever that had swept through their village like an invisible scythe. The distant relatives who had taken her in had been quick to apprentice her to the Russell household, eager to have one less mouth to feed. There would be no welcome for her there, no forgiveness for returning in disgrace. The world had narrowed. To this moment, this path, this solitary struggle against the tide of misfortune that seemed determined to drag her under, even the birds seemed to mock her with their carefree songs, their freedom a stark contrast to her earthbound suffering. Her fingers absently traced the frayed blue linen ribbon tied around her wrist, the last gift from the old woman who had taught her to sew, who had seen something of worth in her clumsy, childish hands. It was all that remained of her former life, this small token of affection, this testament to the fact that she had once been valued, if only briefly. The sun climbed higher, its heat beginning to press down upon her with physical weight. The world around Annette had begun to take on a strange, dreamlike quality, colors too vivid, sounds too sharp, her vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in like spilled ink on parchment. The path before her seemed to undulate, as if the very earth were breathing beneath her feet. She did not immediately register the moment when her legs finally betrayed her, when her knees buckled and the ground rose up to meet her with cruel force. The impact knocked what little breath remained from her lungs, her cheek pressing against the cool earth, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion, hunger, and despair that had been her only companions through the long night. As consciousness began to slip away, Annette felt a strange sense of relief washing over her. Perhaps this was the answer, the release she had not known she was seeking. Perhaps the earth would simply reclaim her, and the pain would end. The cicadas continued their relentless chorus in the trees above, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath them. The sun continued its journey across the sky, shadows shifting imperceptibly around her prone form. The world continued in its ordered cycle, unmoved by the plight of one insignificant girl. And it was into this indifferent world that fate introduced its most unexpected element, the distant sound of carriage wheels and hoofbeats. Drawing steadily closer along the deserted road, in the opulent interior of the approaching carriage, Etienne Marquis de Balcourt sat in contemplative silence, his tall frame rigid despite the luxurious cushions surrounding him. At 42, he carried his years with the dignified restraint expected of his station, though the fine lines around his eyes and the single streak of silver at his temple hinted at sorrows that his controlled expression did not reveal. Journey from his townhouse in Bordeaux to his country estate at Valcourt was one he had made countless times. A journey that had once been filled with anticipation and pleasure, but which now represented nothing more than a necessary transition between obligations. Since the death of his wife 5 years earlier, Etienne had retreated into a life of quiet solitude, fulfilling his duties to king and country with mechanical precision, while keeping the chaotic mesences of human emotion at a safe distance. The countryside, passing outside his window-lush vineyards, rolling hills, ancient oak groves once a source of pride and joy, now served merely as a familiar backdrop to his thoughts, which turned endlessly around matters of estate management, political machinations at court, and the mathematical precision of his financial affairs. He had constructed a life of perfect order in the aftermath of devastating loss, a life where surprise had no place, where each day followed the last with predictable sameness, where pain was kept at bay through careful attention to routine and responsibility. It was a life that suited him, or so he had convinced himself over the years of practicing this careful isolation. Perhaps it was this very retreat into ordered solitude that made the disruption when it came so impossible to ignore. His gaze, usually unfocused during these journeys, suddenly sharpened on an irregularity at the side of the road, a splash of faded color against the dusty earth, a shape that did not belong among the natural contours of the landscape. For a moment, he considered allowing the carriage to continue its progress, to maintain the boundary between himself and whatever human difficulty lay crumpled in the dirt. The coachman had not noticed, or had chosen to ignore the figure. Would be so easy to do the same, to continue in the safe cocoon of non-involvement. Yet something, perhaps a flash of memory, perhaps a flicker of the man he had once been, caused his hand to rise. A sharp rap on the roof of the carriage, signaling his driver to halt. The abrupt stop sent a jolt through the vehicle, causing the fine leather of the seats to creak in protest. Without waiting for his coachman to open the door, Etienne stepped down, his polished boots landing with an authoritative thud on the packed earth of the road. His movements were fluid but controlled as he approached the prone figure, its expression carefully neutral, betraying nothing of the internal conflict that had prompted this uncharacteristic action. Drawing closer, he saw that what had appeared at first to be a bundle of discarded clothing was in fact a young woman, her skin ashen beneath a layer of dust and grime. Dark hair splayed around her face in stark contrast to the pallor of her skin. There was something in her abandoned posture that struck him with unexpected force of vulnerability that cut through his carefully maintained distance. Crouching beside her, Etienne noted the ragged state of her clothing, the rawness of her feet, the dried blood at her temple. This was not the calculated destitution of a professional beggar, but the desperate circumstance of someone who had fallen suddenly from some modest security. Without conscious thought, his fingers moved to her wrist, seeking the pulse that would confirm she still lived. The faint but steady throb beneath his fingertips prompted a decision that surprised even him. Rising to his full height, he turned to his coachman, who had approached with cautious curiosity. "Take her to Balkert," he said, his tone making it clear that this was not a suggestion but a command. The servant's momentary hesitation was quickly masked, years of training overriding any personal opinion he might have harbored about his master's uncharacteristic behavior. Together, they lifted the unconscious girl, her weight alarmingly slight, and placed her carefully on the opposite seat of the carriage. Etienne resumed his position, his gaze deliberately averted from the still form across from him, as if by not looking directly at her, he could maintain some semblance of the distance he had cultivated so carefully. As the carriage lurched forward once more, continuing its journey toward Balkert, Etienne found himself wondering at his own actions. What had possessed him to involve himself in the fate of this stranger? What compulsion had driven him to break the careful patterns of his existence? These questions circled in his mind like restless birds, finding no perch, no resolution. What he could not know, as the horses pulled them steadily toward his ancestral home, was that this single impulsive act of mercy would set in motion events that would shatter the careful isolation he had built around himself, challenging everything he thought he knew about his place in the world and about the capacity of his heart to feel once more, unbeknownst to both the unconscious girl and the distracted Marquis. Their departure from the scene was observed by watchful eyes. Standing in the dappled shadows of the oak grove, a woman of middle years, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, her clothing of good quality, but deliberately understated, followed the progress of the carriage with an expression that combined calculation and something akin to satisfaction. Madame Perrault, housekeeper to the Marquis de Balkert for nearly 2 decades, had been returning from a rare visit to her sister in a neighboring village when chance had placed her in the position to witness this unexpected encounter. Unlike the Marquis's other servants, Madame Perrault had known him since childhood, had witnessed his growth from solemn boy to reserved man, but observed with quiet concern as grief had transformed him into the isolated figure he had become. For years, she had watched him retreat further into himself, had seen the light of engagement dim in his eyes, replaced by a mechanical adherence to duty and routine. Now, as she watched the carriage disappear down the winding road toward Balkert, she felt a stirring of something she had nearly forgotten: hope. This unprecedented action, this break-in pattern, suggested that perhaps somewhere beneath the careful armor her master had constructed, the capacity for spontaneous compassion still existed. Whether this development would prove a blessing or a complication remained to be seen, but as Madame Perrault gathered her skirts and began the walk that would bring her back to Balkert by a different path, she allowed herself a small smile. Change had come to the ordered world of the Marquis de Balkert, and while change brought risk, it also carried the possibility of renewal. The wheels had been set in motion, and now they would all discover where this unexpected road might lead. Consciousness returned to Annette in fragments, disorienting flashes of sensation that her mind struggled to assemble into coherence. The first thing she became aware of was the absence of discomfort, the shocking softness beneath her body, the clean scent of the air she breathed, the gentle warmth that enveloped her. These sensations were so foreign to her recent experience that for a moment she wondered if she had died. If this strange comfort was some antechamber to the afterlife her village priest had spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. But the dull ache in her head and the persistent weakness in her limbs gradually convinced her that she remained firmly tethered to the world of the living. Slowly, cautiously, she opened her eyes, immediately overwhelmed by the unfamiliar splendor that surrounded her. The ceiling above her was impossibly high, adorned with delicate plasterwork that traced patterns she couldn't begin to decipher. The bed beneath her was vast, the sheets so fine they felt like water against her skin. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny constellations. The room itself was larger than the entire cottage where she had spent her childhood, its proportions designed to emphasize the insignificance of its occupants. Fear crept through her veins like ice water as the strangeness of her situation became fully apparent. Where was she? She'll come to be here. Most importantly, what would be expected of her in return for this unexpected luxury? The words hung in the air like an executioner's axe. The Marquis has ordered that you remain here until your complete recovery. Though softly spoken, they landed with the weight of iron chains upon Onette's consciousness. The maid who delivered this sentence stood at perfect attention, her expression carved from emotional marble, betraying neither sympathy nor suspicion. Her hands folded primly at her waist, neither fidgeted nor trembled, the mark of someone who had learned that stillness was synonymous with survival in great houses such as this. The click of the door as she departed seemed unnecessarily loud in the sudden silence, and though Annette heard no key turn in the lock, she understood with the intuition of the powerless that invisible barriers could prove more impenetrable than oak and iron. She was a prisoner, clothed in apparent freedom. A contradiction she had encountered too many times in her short life to mistake for genuine charity. The elegant furnishings surrounding Hertha lacquered escritoire in the corner, the velvet-polstered chair by the window, tapestries depicting pastoral scenes she could never hope to experience, these were not comforts but complications, setting a stage for expectations she could neither anticipate nor fulfill. In the world she knew, luxury always demanded payment, and the higher the luxury, the steeper the price that would eventually be exacted. With cautious movements that belied her growing anxiety, Annette approached the tray of food the maid had left. Steam rose from a bowl of soup thick with carrots and leeks, its aroma triggering an involuntary response as her empty stomach clenched with painful need. Beside it sat a small loaf of fresh bread, a curl of pale yellow butter on a porcelain dish, and a cluster of grapes still attached to the stem, their purple-green skin dusted with a bloom that spoke of recent harvest. She reached for the spoon but hesitated, her fingers trembling not from weakness alone, but from the strangeness of the moment. This private feast laid before her when just hours ago she had been face down in the dirt of a forgotten road. Incongruity made the food itself seem untrustworthy, as if consuming it would bind her to some unspoken pact. Yet hunger proved stronger than suspicion, and she began to eat with slow, deliberate movements, savoring each spoonful as if it might be snatched away at any moment. The warmth of the broth spread through her chest, awakening nerves that had gone numb with exhaustion and despair. Her body welcomed the sustenance even as her mind remained vigilant, alert to the footsteps that occasionally passed her door, to the muffled voices that carried through the thick walls, to the mystery of her presence in this place that defied all reasonable explanation. As her strength gradually returned, so too did her capacity for complex thought. And with it came questions that multiplied like shadows at dusk. Who was this Marquis, who had plucked her from certain death only to install her in what appeared to be a guest chamber? What purpose could he have for such uncharacteristic charity? Most troubling of all, what would he expect from her once she had regained her health? As afternoon began to paint golden streaks across the polished wood, Flora's Annette explored her surroundings with growing curiosity. This was no servant's quarters with its narrow cot and functional simplicity. This was a room designed for people of consequence, for visitors whose comfort mattered, whose opinions carried weight. The bed alone could have housed 3 of her former colleagues from Madame Russell's household. The window overlooked formal gardens that stretched toward a distant tree line. Meticulously planned paths cutting through lawns so perfectly maintained they seemed almost artificial. Inside, every surface gleamed with the particular luster that spoke of daily attention from dedicated hands, the brass fittings on the wardrobe, the mirror's silver backing, the marble top of the small side table. Nothing was allowed to tarnish in this world. Nothing permitted to show the natural decay that characterized life outside these walls. It was beautiful, certainly, but also somehow suffocating in its perfection, as if the very air had been scrubbed. Of all impurities, including the meniscus of genuine human existence, Annette was contemplating this strange dichotomy when she heard footsteps different from the others, more purposeful and measured, approaching her door with deliberate slowness. Her body tensed involuntarily, fingers clutching at the borrowed nightgown as the footsteps stopped and silence descended for 3 agonizing heartbeats before the door swung open. He entered without hesitation, without the tentative courtesy of a knock, his presence immediately filling the room despite his slender frame. The Marquis Etienne de Balcourt stood framed in the doorway for a moment. A study in controlled elegance, even in his relative informality. White shirt with sleeves rolled to expose forearms browned by unexpected sun. Light dark hair slightly disheveled by wind, shoulders set in the unconscious posture of a man accustomed to authority without needing to announce it. What struck Annette most, however, was not his patrician features or his commanding presence, but the profound weariness that seemed to emanate from him like a physical force. Here was a man who carried exhaustion not as a temporary condition, but as a permanent companion, etched into the fine lines around his eyes and the almost imperceptible slump of shoulders that were trained from birth to never bend. He remained near the threshold, neither fully entering her space nor retreating from it, creating a boundary that spoke volumes about his internal conflict. Annette did not lower her gaze as propriety demanded, not out of defiance, but because she lacked the energy for pretense. Their eyes met across the expanse of polished floorboards, and something electric passed between them. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition. 2 souls equally adrift in circumstances neither had chosen, separated by a chasm of birth and fortune, yet connected by the peculiar loneliness that transcends all social barriers. The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring, until he broke it with a voice that matched his appearance, controlled, measured, neither warm nor cold, but precisely neutral. As if emotional inflection had been carefully excised from his vocabulary through years of rigorous practice, his questions came like arrows. Direct and pointed. Did she feel better? Did she remember what had happened? Annette responded with monosyllables, offering nothing beyond what was explicitly requested. She spoke of falling, of having nowhere to go, of needing nothing more than she had already been given. When he pressed further, asking where she had come from, if anyone was searching for her, if anyone even knew she was alive, she wrapped half-truths in vague statements, not from calculated deception, but from the instinctive self-preservation that had been her only consistent teacher since childhood. She did not mention the Russell household, nor the missing reliquary, nor the swift judgment that had cast her into the streets without recourse. These admissions would only mark her as tainted goods, damaged property to be discarded once more. The Marquis watched her with an intensity that suggested he was solving a puzzle rather than conversing with a fellow human. His jaw worked slightly, evidence of internal conflict she could not decipher. Something about her response, or perhaps her lack of expected response, clearly disturbed him. She returned his scrutiny without flinching, her dark eyes holding questions of their own. They remained locked in this silent assessment, each searching for clues to the other's true intentions, each finding only more mysteries. For Etienne de Balcourt, this slip of a girl represented a disruption to carefully ordered existence, her quiet dignity at odds with her desperate circumstances. Her unreadable expression neither grateful nor frightened, but watchful, as if she were cataloging his every movement for future reference. For Annette, the Marquise embodied everything she had been taught to fear and respect: power without accountability, authority without check, yet something in his deliberate restraint, in the shadows behind his eyes, suggested complexities she had not expected to find in a man of his station. When he finally departed, Annette remained motionless on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap. Gaze fixed on the closed door as if expecting it to reveal answers to unasked questions. The ensuing hours passed with excruciating slowness, each minute stretching into the next with leaden consistency. Beyond her room, house continued its rhythmic existence, the muted clink of silverware from distant dining rooms, the soft footfalls of servants moving with practiced efficiency, the almost imperceptible creak of floorboards adjusting to temperature changes as evening approached. These sounds formed a language she was beginning to decipher, a soundtrack to the hidden hierarchy that governed every aspect of this grand establishment. Though she had not yet encountered the housekeeper directly, Annette sensed her presence like a subtle change in atmospheric pressure. The whispers that occasionally drifted past her door quickly hushed when footsteps approached, told her that her presence in the East Wing was more than unusual. It was provocative, potentially scandalous. The precision with which her meals arrived, the careful neutrality of the maid assigned to her, the quality of the garments provided for her use all suggested decisions made by someone accustomed to managing delicate situations with discreet efficiency. What remained unclear was whether this unseen force was acting as ally or adversary, whether her comfort was being ensured out of genuine concern or merely to maintain appearances. While more permanent solutions were arranged, darker still were the murmurs that occasionally reached her, fragments of concern about the Marquis acting on impulse, about exposure to scandal, about a commitment to a woman of impeccable bloodline and untouchable reputation. These whispers raised the stakes of her presence from mere inconvenience to potential catastrophe, transforming her from anonymous waif to active threat in the carefully balanced ecosystem of Balkurt. As night descended, wrapping the gardens in deepening shadows, Annette approached the window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Beyond the pane lay a landscape of impossible perfection, hedges trimmed to geometric precision, silent fountains whose waters would sparkle come morning, stone statues frozen in eternal poses of classical beauty. The gardens of Balkurt were not wild, not natural, or meticulously controlled expressions of man's dominion over nature. Beautiful, certainly, but also somehow oppressive in their refusal to acknowledge chaos or decay. Each plant knew its place, each path served its purpose, each vista was calculated for maximum aesthetic impact. It was a world designed to impress rather than welcome, to emphasize the gulf between those who could command such perfection and those who could only marvel at it from a distance. Annette stood motionless for a long time, absorbing the symbolism of what lay before her, contemplating what actions remained available to her in this gilded cage. She needed to recover her strength, to formulate a plan that would allow her to leave without creating additional complications, to find a path forward when all previous paths had been severed. The irony did not escape her that her position now, physically comfortable but fundamentally precarious, mirrored her situation at the Russell household before accusation had transformed security into catastrophe. Then, as now, her fate rested in hands not her own, her future contingent on the whims of those whose power exceeded her own by measures she could barely comprehend. As darkness claimed the final corners of the garden, blending statuary and foliage into indistinguishable silhouettes, Annette felt a corresponding shift within herself, hardening of resolve, a sharpening of focus. She would accept the Marquis's charity for now, would rebuild her strength beneath this ornate roof, but she would not allow herself to become indebted beyond her capacity to repay. Whatever game was being played in the grand halls of Balkurt, she refused to remain merely a pawn to be sacrificed when convenient. Across the mansion, in the long gallery illuminated by newly lit candelabras, Etienne de Balkurt walked alone, his footsteps echoing softly against marble floors that had supported his ancestors for generations. He had changed his attire since the afternoon, but only marginally, the same white shirt, now with cuffs unbuttoned entirely, as if even this small formality had become too burdensome to maintain. His gaze remained fixed on the floor before him, his thoughts visibly turned inward as he navigated the familiar corridors with unconscious precision. Upon reaching her door, he paused, hand half raised in uncharacteristic indecision. Something about the girl troubled him deeply, not her circumstances, which were unfortunate but hardly unprecedented, nor her reticence, which was entirely appropriate given their respective positions. Now, what disturbed his carefully maintained equilibrium was the unsettling clarity he had glimpsed in her eyes. It's a form of understanding that seemed to penetrate the carefully constructed facade he presented to the world. She had looked at him not with the expected gratitude of the rescued or the calculated deference of the socially inferior, but with a direct assessment that bordered on equalities if she saw not the Marquis, but the man, with all his hidden fractures and carefully concealed doubts. This unexpected transparency had left him unbalanced, aware of vulnerabilities he had thought successfully buried beneath layers of privilege and protocol, before he could resolve his conflicted impulses. The moment of decision was snatched away by the appearance of a servant rounding the corner with hurried steps. A sealed letter extended on a silver salver. The interruption was perhaps providential, saving him from an encounter he was not prepared to navigate. With practiced automaticity, he accepted the missive, his fingers instantly recognizing the ducal seal pressed into dark red wax. Breaking the seal with precise movements that betrayed no emotion, he unfolded the heavy paper and scanned its contents. Only a single line occupied the center of the page, written in the elegant, authoritative hand of Elise de Montreux. "We shall meet at Balkert before week's end." 7 words that carried the weight of obligation, expectation, and inescapable social covenant. The blood drained from Etienne's face as the implications crystallized with cold clarity. The world he had carefully held at bay was now advancing. With determined steps, in the presence of an unknown woman in his household, a woman whose circumstances would invite speculation and scandal, had suddenly transformed from minor complication to potential disaster. Morning arrived with deceptive serenity, cloudless sky stretching like blue silk above the estate. Air unusually still, as if nature itself were holding its breath in anticipation. Despite the pastoral tranquility outside, inside the walls of Balkert, a silent storm was brewing, detectable only in the subtle intensification of routine activities. Servants moved with increased purpose, their usual efficiency tinged with a barely perceptible urgency. Doors opened and closed with muffled precision. Orders were exchanged in hushed tones. Tasks were completed with heightened attention to detail. These were not the ordinary rhythms of a great house at work, but the careful preparations of a fortress. Preparing for inspection by those whose approval determined its very survival, Etienne paced the north gallery with hands clasped behind his back, shoulders rigid with tension that radiated from his core like heat from banked coals. The letter had been read and reread throughout a sleepless night, its brevity masking complexities that threatened to unravel years of careful emotional containment. Elise de Montreux's impending arrival was not simply a social call, but a calculated move in a game of matrimonial chess that had been suspended during his extended period of mourning. That suspension, initially respected out of propriety, had gradually transformed into a source of whispered speculation in the salons of Bordeaux. Questions had been raised about his continued reluctance, about whether genuine grief had calcified into convenient excuse. The daughter of the Duke of Arces was not a woman accustomed to indefinite delay, nor was she naive about the politics of marriage among their class. Her decision to come to Balkert now, announced with such minimal notice, carried unmistakable intent. The time for patience had passed. Decisions must be made. Commitments either honored or formally dissolved. Throughout the lower floors, servants polished silver until it gleamed like liquid moonlight, beat dust from heavy draperies, and arranged fresh flowers in crystal vases with mathematical precision. Every surface was scrutinized, every corner inspected, every potential imperfection addressed before it could be discovered by critical eyes. Madame Charpentier, the housekeeper whose authority within these walls was exceeded only by the Marquis himself, directed the symphony of preparation with quiet intensity. Her instructions, delivered in tones that never rose above conversational level, yet carried the force of absolute command. Her attention, however, repeatedly returned to the closed door behind which Annette rested, her gaze lingering with calculated assessment. The girl's presence in the East Wing, where family and honored guests were traditionally housed, represented more than a breach of protocol. It was a potential flashpoint for precisely the kind of scandal that could derail carefully laid plans and resurrect whispers that had only recently begun to fade. That morning, acting with the preemptive decisiveness that had secured her position over 2 decades of service, she arranged for a simple but new dress of light gray cotton to be delivered to the girl, accompanied by a small embroidery frame, with linen stretched tight across its wooden circumference. The message accompanying these items was clear in its directive, yet ambiguous in its implication. She could work on the embroidery intended for the Marquis's library, but must not leave her room without explicit permission and never without accompaniment. Later, when the girl requested fresh air, a request that could not reasonably be denied without raising questions about her status within the household, the maid assigned to her, a young woman selected specifically for her impassive countenance and unwavering loyalty, was instructed to escort her only as far as the conservatory, where she could experience the illusion of outdoors, while remaining safely contained within the controlled environment of Balcourt. Annette moved through the greenhouse without disturbing the fragile peace that hung among the leafy inhabitants, while feeling the weight of Mrs. Blackwood's gaze following her every step. The caretaker had allowed her entry without judgment, though her eyes seemed to measure each of Annette's movements with careful precision. Inside, warmth embraced her like a forgotten friend, along with the rich scent of damp soil and new growth that permeated the air. Light filtered through the fogged glass, casting everything in a submerged, otherworldly glow that made the outside world seem distant and irrelevant. For the first time since her arrival at Balcourt Manor, Annette breathed with something approaching ease, the suffocating confinement of her room having begun to wear on her spirit. Far more than even the fresh memories of her expulsion, she approached a work table with tentative curiosity, her fingers brushing against various gardening implements as she attempted to move a small terracotta pot. Her hand suddenly collided with something small and hard, hidden among the tools, something that didn't belong among trowels and pruning shears. Carefully lifting the object, Annette found herself holding a miniature portrait of exquisite craftsmanship. From within an oval of ivory, a young woman with pearl-adorned golden hair gazed back at her with an expression of aristocratic detachment. She wore white, her posture impossibly perfect, lips pressed together in a firm line that betrayed no warmth or tenderness. On the gold frame, almost too small to read, was engraved a name and date: Elis, 1772. A peculiar weight seemed to pull at Annette's hands as she held it, a weight that had nothing to do with the physical heft of gold or ivory, but something far more profound that made her heart quicken to an unfamiliar rhythm, with careful movements betraying her sudden unease. Annette returned the portrait to its hiding place, though questions bloomed in her mind like the greenhouse flowers around her. There was no need to ask who the woman might be, or why such an image had been abandoned, perhaps deliberately concealed in this seldom visited corner of the estate. In that moment, she understood with painful clarity that her presence at Balcourt Manor made no logical sense beyond mere caprice. The difference between herself and the woman in the portrait wasn't merely one of surname, education, or lineage. It was that one belonged naturally to this world of privilege and refinement, while the other merely survived on its precarious margins, always at risk of being cast out at the slightest misstep. That evening, however, when Annette had resigned herself to being a ghost in the household, present but unseen, she encountered the Marquis once more. Their meeting occurred in the West Wing gallery as silence began to blanket the manor like evening mist. She was emerging from the sewing room with an embroidery frame clutched in her hands, while he appeared to be returning from the library, his tall figure casting long shadows against the paneled walls. They found themselves face to face in the middle of the lengthy corridor, illuminated only by the gentle sway of candlelight that cast dancing shadows across their features. Neither moved immediately, seemingly surprised by the encounter, though not visibly discomforted by it. He greeted her with a voice lowered to a near whisper, as if reluctant to let the hallway itself overhear their exchange. She responded with a simple nod, but against all expectations and propriety. They began to converse. Their dialogue began innocuously enough, with comments about the day's work and the embroidery she had been commissioned to complete. Yet somehow, Through some alchemy of the evening shadows and the unlikely intimacy of their chance meeting, they soon found themselves speaking of matters neither had voiced aloud before. Annette told him, without seeking pity, how she had taught herself to read by copying letters from the meat and wine advertisements that hung in the marketplace, and how sometimes, when no one was watching, she would steal scraps of paper and hoard them like precious jewels. She spoke with a curious blend of shame and pride that she couldn't quite disguise, her words tumbling forth as if long held back by a dam that had suddenly, explicably, cracked open under the weight of his attentive silence. The Marquis listened, not with the condescension of someone hearing a curious anecdote, but with an attentive silence that communicated more than words ever could. Then, without quite meaning to, began to speak of his mother, a reserved woman who would spend entire afternoons embroidering handkerchiefs. He recounted finding her weeping alone in the family chapel. When he was still a boy, a memory he couldn't comprehend until years later, when he realized her. Marriage had been merely another transaction disguised as promise and devotion. It was an impossible conversation that should never have occurred, a nobleman and a common seamstress speaking as equals in the half-light. Yet it existed, as real and tangible as the nearness of their voices in the gathering darkness. When they parted ways, it was without ceremony or formal pleasantries. Each returned along opposite paths, yet both carried the unspoken knowledge that something fundamental had shifted between them, though neither could have articulated precisely what had changed or what it might mean. The following morning, the household awakened once more to precise, purposeful movements throughout its chambers and corridors. This time, however, it wasn't preparation, but arrival that drove the activity. From one of the upper floor windows, Annette observed the gravel path leading to the main entrance, her eyes fixed on the approaching vehicle as her mind replayed fragments of the previous night's impossible conversation with the master of the house. The sky stretched clear and vast above, with clouds still threaded through with golden morning. Light as a dark, elegant Berlin carriage with gleaming metal fittings and velvet curtains advanced along the final curve of the driveway. The Montreux family crest adorned its doors, a symbol of power and lineage that seemed to proclaim ownership. Over all it surveyed. The coachman descended first, followed by a footman who assisted a woman from the carriage with practiced deference. She wore ivory silk that caught the morning light like freshly fallen snow, her dress perfectly tailored to emphasize her slender waist. Her hands covered in lace gloves, and her hat adorned with delicate feathers that trembled slightly with each measured step she took across the gravel. Her movements were deliberate and graceful, as if the world itself adjusted its rotation to accommodate her presence. She displayed no hesitation as she ascended the manor steps, her gaze fixed forward, neither seeking approval nor acknowledgement from her surroundings. Annette watched the entire procession with unwavering attention, studying this elegant stranger, as one might observe a natural phenomenon both beautiful and potentially destructive. Without needing confirmation, she knew instinctively that this woman had not come merely to visit Balkert, Manor. She had come to claim what she believed rightfully hers. The arrival of Elise de Montreux didn't merely alter the rhythm of Balkert household, redrew the manor's invisible boundaries with glacial precision that sent ripples of change through every corridor and chamber. Nothing continued as before in the wake of her arrival. Younger servants found themselves reassigned to the stables or outer gardens, effectively banished from the main house. The noble wings became exclusively reserved for guests and for the soft, deliberate footsteps of Madame Montreux, who traversed the corridors as if mentally measuring each corner, each scent, each stitch in the tapestries that adorn the walls. No one spoke above a whisper anymore, as if the very air had grown too thin and dense simultaneously to carry unnecessary sounds. Throughout the house, a new tension pervaded, but unmistakably like the stillness before a storm that everyone could sense approaching but no one dared acknowledge aloud. Annette received word that very morning that she must vacate her room without delay. A small, silent maid appeared at her door, instructing her to gather her belongings with an expression that conveyed both sympathy and the unmistakable message that resistance would be futile. There wasn't much to pack: a linen ribbon, a pair of needles she had managed to acquire, a clean handkerchief, All the modest possessions of a life lived on the margins. She was relocated to a forgotten sewing room in the rear wing, where tall windows faced ancient trees that swayed dramatically against the sky, as if reaching for something forever beyond their grasp. The room was small and antiquated, with tangled threads still abandoned in drawers, and the persistent smell of stored fabric embedded in the walls. It was here, under the watchful eye of Madame Charpentier, that she would now be expected to remain invisible and useful. She offered no protest at this relegation. Annette had learned to read the signals of a household closing ranks against outsiders, and this development came as no surprise. Nor did it hurt quite as much as she might have anticipated. Rather, it served as a stark reminder that what she had momentarily believed possible, that conversation in the gallery, where words had flowed freely across the divide of station, had been nothing more than a temporary aberration, mistake of circumstance, rather than a genuine bridge between their worlds. Now everything and everyone returned to their proper places, and she must resume hers, invisible, silent, and useful only for the skills her hands possessed. Elis moved through the manor as if it were already hers by right rather than by prospect. Her voice remained soft, yet carried unmistakable authority that lingered in rooms even after she had departed. She wore gowns of heavy fabric and pale, subdued colors that contrasted sharply with the shadows that seemed to lurk behind her gaze. Appeared not to notice anyone she deemed irrelevant to her purposes. And Annette certainly fell into that category of the unworthy of acknowledgement. At least that remained true until the day of the accident, which arose from a combination of another's clumsiness and Annette's surprisingly quick reflexes. A maid stumbled over the edge of a carpet and inadvertently nudged a small table supporting an antique hand-painted vase adorned with intricate floral patterns. The precious object wobbled precariously for what seemed an eternity, suspended between safety and destruction. Annette, passing by with a basket of fabrics, dropped everything without hesitation and lunged forward, catching the vase between her hands with unexpected agility before it could shatter against the marble floor. Les, who had been observing the unfolding scene from the adjoining salon's staircase, paused in her descent. She studied Annette with careful deliberation, as if attempting to categorize what she had just witnessed, or perhaps recalculating some internal assessment. Then, with measured steps that echoed softly but decisively against the marble floor, she approached. "You have quick reflexes," she remarked with neutral detachment, not waiting for a response that she clearly didn't require. Her gaze swept over the basket Annette had abandoned and then assessed her simple, an adorned dress with the calculating eye of someone who placed everyone into precise hierarchical categories at first glance. She showed no sign of recognizing Annette as anything more than another anonymous servant within the household's complex ecosystem. Then, without bothering to introduce herself as if her identity should be universally known, she extracted a delicate handkerchief from an invisible pocket and extended it toward Annette with imperious expectation. "This embroidery requires restoration," she stated flatly. "It belongs to a dressing table set from my family. The stitch pattern is quite ancient. I expect you to reproduce it with absolute precision." She pressed the fabric into Annette's hands as if issuing a minor command that required no discussion or negotiation. Annette responded with only a slight inclination of her head in acknowledgement. She knew better than to ask questions or offer commentary. The proper response was simply to accept the assignment, complete it with skill, and then disappear once more into the household's shadows. Hours later, having retreated again to the unexpected sanctuary of the greenhouse, Annette worked with the singular concentration that belongs uniquely to those who speak through their hands rather than their voices. Sunlight filtered through the misty glass panes, casting warm streaks across the wooden table and illuminating her fingers as they danced across the fabric, weaving something far more consequential than mere threads. As she studied the ancient pattern with its intricate whorls and subtle complexities, she couldn't help but wonder if this task represented mere coincidence or something far more deliberate in the careful calculations of Elis de Montreuil. Could this seemingly insignificant commission hold the threads of something deeper that would forever alter the precarious balance between the two women and the man whose life they now both orbited. Outside the greenhouse windows, the world seemed to have come to a perfect standstill. Only the subtle, rhythmic sound of needle-piercing linen broke the thick silence that enveloped Annette as she worked. This was how Etienne found her when his restless wandering through the mansion led him to the glass structure. He had been pacing the corridors without direction, seeking respite from the ornate drawing rooms filled with forced smiles and calculated pleasantries that had become increasingly suffocating since Elis's arrival. As he passed the greenhouse entrance, some invisible force caused him to pause mid-step. Through the glass panels, he caught sight of Annette bent over her embroidery and found himself utterly incapable of walking away. He remained at the threshold, unannounced and motionless, as if crossing that boundary might shatter something fragile, suspended in the air. Between them, the afternoon light delineated her profile with an impossible precision, catching on loose strands of her hair and transforming them to threads of copper and gold. Her shoulders had lost their defensive rigidity, her expression peaceful, almost serene in its concentration. She bore little resemblance to the wary, wounded young woman he had rescued from the roadside door. Perhaps she was exactly the same, and it was only now that he was truly beginning to see her. Annette sensed his presence with the heightened awareness that comes from a lifetime of needing to know who entered a room, yet she didn't lift her gaze from her work. She continued to guide her needle through the fabric with practiced precision, as though the steady rhythm of her stitches formed a protective barrier around something vulnerable she couldn't yet name. Only when the silence between them stretched beyond comfortable tension did she speak, her eyes still fixed on the delicate pattern emerging beneath her fingers. "I miss the smell of fresh bread from the village ovens at dawn." Etienne didn't respond. Immediately, Steady stepped fully into the greenhouse, closing the distance between them with measured steps before settling into a chair across from her workstation. Nothing on the table did he touch, respecting the careful order she had created in this temporary sanctuary. He observed her for several long moments, his attention drawn to the distinctive stitch pattern forming under her skilled fingers, a technique far more refined and antiquated than what typically appeared in common household embroidery. Curiosity pulled his thoughts away from their previous paths as he wondered where she had acquired such uncommon knowledge. Annette, never pausing in the fluid movement of her hands, seemed to read the unspoken question hovering between them. She explained that she had memorized the pattern after seeing it once on a dress displayed in a shop window, her voice carrying neither pride nor apology as she described how she had committed to memory the thread's path and the rhythm of its curves. Learning through observation alone what others were formally taught, something unexpectedly tender settled between them, then gentle as dust motes floating in sunbeams. Profound in its simplicity. No further words were exchanged, none seeming necessary in that moment of mutual recognition. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, stretching their shadows and painting the greenhouse in amber light. As darkness began to seep between the potted plants and garden tools, eventually Annette lifted her gaze, allowing her eyes to meet his directly for the first time since he'd entered her sanctuary. They exchanged no words, but in that silent communication passed something more honest than either had articulated. Before a recognition of sameness despite their vastly different circumstances, a shared understanding that needed no verbal expression to affirm its existence. Later that night, distant thunder announced an approaching storm long before the first raindrops fell against the manor's ancient stone walls. The sky darkened with alarming swiftness, as if night had decided to arrive hours ahead of schedule. And Balkert Manor transformed from stately home to fortress against the increasingly violent elements. Wind and rain soon began to assault the windows with relentless fury, driving the assembled guests deeper into the shelter of the manor's grand salons. The visitors, nobles and dignitaries invited for the weekend's festivities, huddled in awkward groups, sipping wine in uncomfortable silence, or engaging in the performance of pleasant conversation no one truly desired. Meanwhile, servants rushed through corridors carrying dry towels and lit candles to replace those extinguished by unexpected drafts. Annette, to whom no specific place had been assigned for the evening meal, decided to seek solitude rather than face the indignity of standing uncertain at thresholds, The covered garden pavilion at the far end of the estate seemed to offer the perfect sanctuary from both the weather and unwanted company. Surrounded by ferns and rain-slick stones, she found a seat beneath the rose pavilion's protective arch. Above her, the glass ceiling vibrated with the percussion of raindrops, creating a hypnotic rhythm that momentarily allowed her to forget the uncertain position she occupied within these walls. The air carried the intoxicating scent of rain-soaked earth and tightly closed flower buds, a fragrance that transported her briefly to half-remembered moments of childhood comfort before reality had taught her the cruelty of hope. But reverie offered no protection against physical discomfort, and soon the chill penetrated her thin garments. Her clothes had become damp during her brief exposure to the elements, and as she rose to return to the main house, she discovered, with growing alarm, that the gallery door through which she had entered was now firmly locked from within. She knocked once against the wooden frame, the sound swallowed by thunder. Again, more firmly, with identical results. She didn't call out or scream for assistance. Such displays had never been her way. Having learned early that those who must beg for attention rarely receive the kind they truly need, she lost track of time as she huddled against the wall, seeking minimal shelter, aware only that her fingers had begun to lose sensation and that the trembling in her arms was becoming increasingly difficult to control. Resignation settled over her like a familiar cloak as she considered her limited options: remain where she was until dawn, or until someone happened to pass by. Whichever came first. As cold seeped deeper into her bones, her thoughts drifted toward all she had lost over the years, and more painfully, toward all she had never been permitted to possess in the first place: security, belonging, the simple luxury of being valued. For herself, rather than for her utility. Then, like an apparition, materializing from her unspoken wishes, a figure appeared on the other side of the rain-streaked glass. Edion's expression transformed from distraction to alarm as he registered her presence. He wrenched the door open with sudden urgency, clearly shocked to discover her huddled and shivering in the semi-darkness. Without hesitation or preamble, he closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He unfastened his heavy cloak and draped it around her trembling shoulders, his movements conveying a concern too immediate for verbal expression. As he adjusted the warm fabric around her, his fingers accidentally brushed against hers, and the brief contact sparked something electric and unnamed between them. They froze in perfect stillness, neither breathing nor speaking. While the storm's voice filled the silence, they could not bridge with words. In that suspended moment, balanced precariously between propriety and something far more dangerous. Third presence entered the tableau. At the far end of the gallery, a feminine silhouette emerged from the shadows like a specter summoned by their transgression. Elis stood watching them, her posture rigid and her gaze unflinching as she absorbed every detail of the scene before her. Though her face remained composed, something in her eyes made it abundantly clear that what she had witnessed would not be forgotten or forgiven when morning came to wash away the night's indiscretions. The days following the storm brought no relief from the tension that now permeated Balkert Manor like rising floodwaters. Though the sky cleared to reveal perfect blue once more, it seemed to hang lower and heavier over the estate, as if the very atmosphere had become complicit in the unspoken drama unfolding beneath its watch. Elise de Montreo made no direct reference to the scene she had witnessed in the garden gallery. There were no accusations flung in heated moments, no veiled questions designed to trap either party in damning admissions. Yet everything about her had undergone a subtle but profound transformation that was apparent to anyone with eyes to see. Her visits to the library became noticeably more frequent, her physical presence more commanding as she moved through rooms with the deliberate grace of a woman laying claim to her territory. Her words, though still delivered in that soft, cultured voice, now carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood from the unwary. During her conversations with Etienne, she began to weave casual but persistent allusions to their upcoming wedding, discussing possible dates for the public announcement, the political stability their union would ensure between House Balkert and the Duchy of Arces. the strategic advantages that would flow from joining their ancient bloodlines. She spoke at length of her bridal gown being crafted in Paris, of the cathedral where her mother had exchanged vows, of the distinguished guests expected to attend their reception. She never demanded explicit confirmation or pressed for immediate decisions. Her approach was far more sophisticated and ultimately more difficult to oppose. Each suggestion carried the unmistakable weight of foregone conclusion, as if their marriage were a matter already settled, requiring only the formality of ceremony to complete. Etienne listened to these monologues from his armchair beside the library fire, elbows resting on its upholstered arms, his face a careful mask of attentive neutrality. His responses remained unfailingly courteous, but increasingly non-committal, composed of short, evasive phrases that acknowledged her words without engaging with their substance. Anyone observing closely would have noticed how, whenever Elis spoke of shared futures and noble alliances, his mind seemed to drift elsewhere, the memory of Annette sitting in greenhouse light, her fingers stained with thread and wearing, an expression of such concentrated purpose that it had somehow undone something fundamental within him. Elis noticed this disconnection. With the heightened perception of a woman whose future security hangs in the balance, she sensed his mental absence like a cold draft entering through an improperly sealed window, and though she never directly acknowledged it, the awareness hardened her manner perceptibly. Her smiles grew more rigid, her observations more pointed, her entire demeanor more precisely controlled, as if by perfecting her external presentation, she might secure the outcome that suddenly seemed less certain than before. She began to engage Madame Charpentier in longer conversations while spending less time in Etienne's exclusive company. The tension remained unspoken, yet it pervaded every corner of the house, tainting even the most mundane interactions with unacknowledged significance. Meanwhile, Annette found herself abruptly relocated from her quarters near the noble wing without explanation or apology. A maid appeared at her door one morning with instructions to gather her belongings immediately. No reason was provided, no justification offered for this sudden change in her circumstances, only a curt indication of her new accommodations in the lower passages where the youngest housemaid slept. The space assigned to her was narrow and austere, with cold stone walls that held the chill even on warm days, and a bed too short to accommodate her full height when stretched out. She accepted the demotion without complaint or protest. Having learned long ago the futility of questioning decisions made by those who controlled her fate, she understood with painful clarity that her very presence had become problematic, that whatever fragile connection had begun to blossom between stolen words and meaningful silences must now be allowed to wither before it grew dangerous for both herself and the man who occupied her thoughts with increasing frequency. Rumors regarding her unusual relationship with the Marquis began to circulate through the house with the insidious speed of spilled water seeking the lowest point. Glances lingered longer when she passed, whispers growing more frequent and less discreet. Some servants regarded her with open suspicion, others with barely disguised contempt for what they perceived as inappropriate ambition. Even Madame Charpentier, once a neutral if not sympathetic presence, now went out of her way to avoid crossing paths with Annette in corridors or workrooms. While her formal position within the household had not been officially diminished, in every practical sense she had been demoted a useful reminder, she told herself. If truths she should never have allowed herself to forget, she did not belong in this world of privilege and protocol, nor would she ever be permitted to truly enter it. She channeled her frustration and wounded pride into her work, completing the embroidery Elis had commissioned with painstaking perfection. Each stitch became an exercise in forgetting, in burying feelings that had no rightful place in her reality. Yet when the time came to return the finished piece, Annette found herself unable to face those cold, assessing eyes directly. Another servant to deliver the handkerchief in her stead, unwilling to subject herself to further scrutiny or comparison, and least of all to pity from the woman who rightfully occupied the position to which Annette had never aspired, yet somehow found herself cast as rival. She made deliberate efforts to avoid the Marquis as well. When she heard footsteps in the corridor, she would pause and wait for them to pass. If she glimpsed his tall figure from a distance, she would quickly change direction, finding alternative routes to her destination. Storm-drenched night to the brief touch of his fingers against hers, to the weight and warmth of his cloak around her shoulders, to the charged silence that had communicated far more than she was prepared to acknowledge or understand. One evening, as she carried a basket of colored threads toward the storage room, she encountered a housemaid who unwittingly provided information that shattered her careful defenses. The Marquis had been asking about her whereabouts, had expressed displeasure regarding her relocation, had attempted to speak with her, but found himself unable to locate her within the sprawling manor. Hours later, their heart beating in an irregular rhythm that made her lightheaded, she finally saw him. It happened in the stables, where Etienne stood beside the stall, housing his favorite mount. Dressed only in a rumpled white shirt hanging loose over riding breeches, still bearing traces of earth from his afternoon ride. His face was bathed in shadow, illuminated only partially by the oil lamp hanging beside the entrance, throwing the strong angles of his features into dramatic relief. Annette hesitated at the threshold, uncertain whether to proceed or retreat, but her feet moved forward of their own volition, carrying her into his presence before rational thought could reassert control. When he turned and saw her standing there, words seemed to desert him completely. For several long seconds, he simply looked at her, the silence between them stretching taut as a bowstring drawn to its limit. He wanted to ask about her new quarters, about the circulating rumors about her well-being, yet the right phrases refused to form, leaving him floundering in uncharacteristic inarticulacy. What finally emerged was awkward and imprecise. A clumsy attempt at expressing concern that fell woefully short of his intention. Annette understood the sentiment behind his faltering words. Yet some self-protective instinct drove her to reject the connection before it could take root and flourish. With a voice deliberately stripped of warmth, she informed him that his concern was unnecessary, that she neither needed nor wanted his compassion, had never sought it from the beginning. He stepped backward as if physically struck by her declaration, his expression betraying nothing, while his eyes momentarily revealed a spark of something painful and quickly extinguished. He offered no argument, no persistence in the face of her rejection. As she watched his retreating figure disappear into the shadows beyond the stable doors, Annette felt something irreparable shift within her chest. But was the pain she now experienced the result of necessary wounds inflicted to prevent greater suffering? Or had she just severed the one genuine connection that might have transformed her life in ways she dared not imagine? That night, Annette returned to her chamber with a heavy heart, her mind a tempest of conflicting emotions that threatened to drown her resolve. The small flame of her candle cast trembling shadows across the walls as she pulled out a sheet of parchment and began to write. She didn't know to whom she was addressing the letter, perhaps to herself, perhaps to the universe that had placed her in this impossible position. But the words needed to escape her chest before they suffocated her. Her pen scratched awkwardly against the paper, her normally elegant handwriting now reduced to jagged, uncertain strokes that mirrored her inner turmoil. "I wanted to forget, but the body remembers," she wrote, only to cross it out immediately. It was a mistake. I should never have allowed it. The crossed-out words soon outnumbered those still legible. Battlefield of ink where her vulnerabilities had tried and failed to find expression. She never finished the letter. She extinguished the candle, surrendering to the weight of unspoken confessions. The stillness of the night was suddenly shattered by a violent metallic crash. The sound reverberated through the dark corridors like thunder. A stable door flung open with force, followed instantly by the frantic pounding of hooves against stone. Annette leaped from her chair, heart racing as she heard muffled shouts, hurried footsteps, and a stable boy's desperate calls for help. Without pausing to consider propriety, she threw a shawl around her shoulders and rushed into the night, her thin nightdress hardly protection against the cold that bit at her skin. The rain had returned, a light but persistent drizzle that transformed the air into a silver mist and turned the ground treacherous beneath her feet. She raced through the service yard, past the kitchen gardens, and through the rear gate, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. By the time she reached the stables, she was soaked to the skin, her dark hair plastered against her face and neck. The scene before her sent a jolt of recognition through her body. Etienne stood in the center of the chaos, his white shirt transparent. With rein and clinging to the contours of his muscular frame, his powerful hands gripped the bridle of a magnificent stallion that thrashed and reared in obvious distress, threatening to break free from its half-secured tether. The Marquis's boots slid in the mud, yet he maintained his stance with grim determination, muscles straining against the animal's formidable strength. When he turned toward the sound of her arrival, his eyes caught the light from the stable lanterns. Shining with the same intensity they had carried before all the walls, between them had been constructed before duty and station and propriety, had reminded them both of the impossibility of their connection. For a breathless moment, it seemed as though nothing had changed, as though they were meeting for the first time again. With all possibilities still open before them, the pale sun that rose over the rooftops of Balkert the following morning seemed reluctant to fully banish the night, casting a ghostly light that did nothing to warm the chill that had settled over the estate. The previous night's commotion had left behind a weighted silence that hung in the corners of the grand house, as if the thundering hooves and shouts had been merely the surface tremors of something far deeper shifting beneath the foundations of their carefully ordered world. For Etienne and Annette, the stable had become more than just the site of a crisis. It was now a painful reminder of what could never be theirs without devastating consequences. The brief moment when their guards had dropped when his eyes had met hers with naked emotion. When her instinct to run toward rather than away from him had revealed itself, had left them both more vulnerable than before. The tension between them stretched taut as an archer's bow, visible but unmistakable, running through hallways and across rooms, manifesting in lingering glances and deliberate absences. Etienne, despite his resolve to maintain distance, found himself drawn back into her orbit through a series of small, almost unconscious gestures. He arranged for her former bedroom to be restored to her use, a silent acknowledgement of her rightful place in the household. He instructed the cook to send freshly baked bread with her morning tray, remembering how she had once mentioned in a rare moment of candor that warm bread reminded her of the only happy memories from her childhood, engineered accidental encounters in the corridors, positioning himself where she would have to pass, hoping desperately that she might look at him as she once had, with that mixture of wonder and wary trust that had first captivated him. But Annette had retreated. Behind walls of her own construction, walls built from equal parts fear and pragmatism, her face had regained that vigilant stillness he had noticed upon their first meeting, the careful blankness of someone who has learned that showing emotion is a luxury they cannot afford. Gone was the slight tremor in her voice when she had shared confidences with him in the gallery. Vanished was the silent amazement in her eyes when his fingers had brushed against hers in the garden. That spring afternoon, in its place stood a polished barrier, impenetrable and perfect in its construction. She no longer sought his conversation or his warmth. She simply performed her duties with flawless precision before disappearing like a ghost into the shadows of the great house. Despite her subtle rejection, Etienne could not bring himself to abandon hope entirely. Something in him refused to accept that what had flared between them had been extinguished so completely. What he could not have anticipated was that the following day would bring with it a figure from the past. Someone Annette had never expected to encounter again, someone whose arrival would cast all their carefully maintained pretenses into disarray. As noon approached, a burgundy carriage made its stately progress up the main drive, the crunch of gravel beneath its wheels drawing curious glances from the servants who glimpsed it through the windows. From its elegant confines emerged a tall woman with impeccable posture and a serene, unreadable expression. Madame Duvivier had been, in distant years, the closest thing to a maternal figure that Annette had ever known. Not a relative, not a wealthy benefactress, but an occasional protector during Annette's first years in the city. When she had survived as an apprentice, shuttling between sewing workshops and crowded marketplaces, Madame Duvivier had provided shelter when she needed it most, had offered counsel when others offered only judgment, had taught her to hold her head high, even when the world seemed determined to force her gaze downward. The visit came without announcement, Yet in the salons of Valkert, few occurrences passed unnoticed or unremarked upon. Elis received her with a coolness tempered only by the demands of courtesy. In private, without excessive preamble, the older woman explained the purpose behind her unexpected arrival. She had heard whispers, she said, fragments of gossip concerning a girl without a surname living within a noble house. She did not mention Annette by name, but her words carried unmistakable intent, each one honed to a razor's edge. Elis, with the acute perception that had always been her most formidable weapon, understood immediately to whom the woman referred. Their conversation remained deliberately vague, yet clear enough for a troubling narrative to emerge with devastating clarity. A girl raised without parents, accused of theft, dismissed without trial, now inexplicably sheltered by a widowed Marquis. Madame Duvivier brought no evidence, but she carried something more damaging, enough doubt to cast shadows over even the purest intentions. When Etienne heard the account, presented with calculated casualness during dinner that evening, every muscle in his body tensed in immediate response to the threat. He said nothing in that moment, but something within him closed like a fist around his heart. The possibility that Annette had concealed such a significant chapter of her past filled him not with righteous indignation, but with something murkier and more painful betrayal. Not because he believed her guilty of the accusations, but because she had not trusted him enough to reveal this truth. In all their shared afternoons, in every story woven between confidences exchanged in low voices, she had omitted a truth that now left him defenseless against those who questioned his judgment. He felt suddenly exposed, as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted without warning, leaving him unbalanced and uncertain where once he had been resolute. The realization that there might be parts of her he did not know, parts she had deliberately kept hidden and settled something fundamental in his understanding of their connection. Annette learned nothing directly of what had transpired, but she sensed it with a painful acuity born from years of reading the subtle shifts in atmosphere that often preceded disaster. She noticed it in his altered gait, in the more measured tone of his voice, in the way he no longer sought her with his gaze across crowded rooms. The greetings that had once carried undercurrents of warmth became formal and distant, echoes of proper etiquette rather than genuine connection. She began to feel like a stranger again, as though she had been transported back to that first morning in the mansion, uncertain whether she was there as guest or burden. The distance between them calcified into routine, hardening until it seemed it had always existed. Their paths rarely intersected, and when they did, he appeared distracted, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. She lowered her eyes with a deference that was not her destiny, but her resignation. It's an acknowledgement that whatever spark had flared between them had been extinguished by realities neither could overcome. Elis, ever the tactician, recognized the opportunity presented by this growing void and moved to fill it with calculated precision. She resumed her walks with Etienne through the gardens she had previously avoided, organized horseback rides that showcased her considerable equestrian skills, and accompanied him during meals that grew increasingly prolonged. The Marquis did not reject her company, though neither did he embrace it fully, but her visible presence at his side was sufficient to establish territory. To remind the household of natural order and appropriate stations, she issued orders restricting access to certain wings of the house, instructions discreetly conveyed through Madame Charpentier to the staff. No one spoke the intention aloud, but everyone understood its meaning. The young seamstress was to remain in her assigned place, away from spaces where her presence might be deemed inappropriate or presumptuous. The upper staircases, the east gallery, the covered winter gardenal became forbidden territory. Boundaries she must not cross. Annette offered no protest against these new restrictions. She no longer felt herself part of the narrative unfolding. Within those grand walls, merely a footnote that had persisted beyond its relevance, a thread that had strayed from its intended pattern. One afternoon, as she climbed to the upper floor to deliver a set of repaired tablecloths, she heard voices drifting from the library. She halted instinctively before entering, her heart constricting painfully as she recognized Elise's melodious laughter floating through the partially opened door. She allowed herself one brief glance through the narrow opening, capturing an image that would become indelibly etched in her memory. Etienne seated beside the fireplace, a crystal glass of amber. Wine balanced in his hand, his profile illuminated by dancing flames. Ela stood before him, elegant and assured, offering another glass with a gesture that spoke of intimate familiarity. He accepted it without hesitation, their fingers brushing momentarily. She said something then, words Annette could not distinguish. Clearly, and he smiled in response, not a full laugh. Merely a slight curve of his lips, but enough to confirm what Annette had feared. She felt the air grow thick around her. Stepping backward as though physically struck, closed her eyes against the sight, and descended the stairs silently, each step carrying her further from possibilities that had never truly existed. What she failed to witness was how quickly that smile faded once Elis turned away. How Etienne remained staring into the flames without seeing them. How the wine in his glass remained virtually untouched throughout the evening. That night, in the quiet solitude of her servants' quarters, Annette methodically packed the few possessions she could claim as her own. This was not an impulsive flight, but a decision long contemplated, measured, inevitable, the only path that remained when all others had been closed to her. Folding her modest collection of clothing required less than 10 minutes. She carefully stored her embroidery hoop, the blue ribbon he had given her weeks earlier, a casual gift he had likely forgotten, a crumpled piece of paper she had once intended to transform into a letter. After a moment's hesitation, she left the ribbon on her dressing table, alongside the half-finished embroidery she had abandoned when her fingers began to tremble too severely to continue the delicate work. She wrote no farewell note, having no words that could adequately express what needed to be said, wanting no explanations that would only prolong pain. She waited until the house had surrendered to slumber, the grand corridors empty and silent beneath the watchful gaze of ancestral portraits. She moved through the darkness with steps made silent by years of practice, navigating the familiar passageways one final time. No one witnessed her departure. No one heard the soft click of the servant's entrance as it closed behind her. Following morning, Etienne entered the sewing room before the household had fully awakened. Seeking her without conscious purpose, driven by some nameless urgency that had disturbed his fitful sleep, he found only emptiness. Her workstation cleared, her presence erased as thoroughly as if she had never existed. As he stood there in the gentle morning light, his fingers touching the abandoned embroidery hoop where her hands had last rested, a terrible realization dawned. She was gone, and with her something vital he had not recognized until its absence left him hollow. But what would drive a woman to disappear without a trace, and what secrets from her past might return to haunt them both if he dared to search for her through the unforgiving streets of a city that devours its lost souls? The fog lingered like a morning veil over the early morning fields, swallowing the silhouettes of trees and rooftops alike, as if the world itself had conspired to erase the path behind her. Annette sat quietly inside the carriage, hands folded, over the box that still held the relic of her disgrace, and now perhaps of her redemption. The rhythmic creaking of the wheels against the gravel road lulled her into a daze that blurred past and present. Her eyes did not leave the horizon, though it was invisible behind the curtain of mist. She did not need to see the road. She knew it by heart. Belkert was not a place anymore. It was a weight in her chest, a name she had buried and now unearthed. And somewhere within its walls, a man waited. Whether out of hope or obligation, she could not yet tell. When the carriage finally arrived at the estate, the driver hesitated before announcing their presence. It was as though even the horses sensed the tension, their hooves stamping the ground with impatient caution. Annette descended slowly, the wind lifting strands of her hair into her face as she stared up at the mansion. It looked smaller then. She remembered, though perhaps it was her own heart that had grown too large for such careful boundaries. The main door opened before she could knock. Madame Charpentier stood in the threshold, her face a mirror of practiced neutrality. But her eyes betrayed something softer relief perhaps, or quiet acknowledgement. No words were exchanged as she stepped aside, allowing Annette to enter. Warmth of the interior was immediate, almost aggressive after the chill outside. But it was not enough to melt the frost she carried inside her ribcage. Everything was as she had, left it almost insultingly so. The tapestry still hung, the stairwell gleamed, and the chandeliers flickered with quiet majesty. Yet there was a vacancy in the air, a silence with too much history behind it. She was escorted to a guest room, not her old quarters, and left alone. The fire had already been lit, the linens folded with care. There were no locks on the door, no servants stationed outside. She had not been brought back as prisoner, but she was not entirely free either. That night, she sat by the hearth, legs drawn to her chest, the relic box on her lap once more. She opened it slowly, as one might unfold a letter from a ghost, and traced the contours of the locket. Her mind, however, was on Etienne, where he was, whether he knew she had returned, and why he had sent for her through a stranger's mouth instead of his own. She did not have to wait long for the answer. The following morning, as sunlight pierced the heavy drapes and etched gold across the velvet curtains, a soft knock came at the door. Annette rose but made no move to open it. After a pause, it opened anyway. Etienne stood there, less a man than a shadow of the one she had known, dressed plainly, hair slightly disheveled as though he had not slept. His eyes met hers with the same intensity that had once made her believe impossible things. He stepped inside but kept his distance. He came back, he said, more to himself than to her. She nodded once, the silence between them thick and fragile. "Why didn't you write?" he asked, voice low, raw. She turned away, her throat tight. "Because I didn't know if you would read it," she said. "And if you did, I didn't know what words could possibly be enough." There was a moment when neither of them breathed, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Then, with a suddenness that startled them both, he crossed the space between them and knelt at her feet. "I should have fought harder," he whispered. "For you, for us?" Annette blinked, not from surprise, but from the sting of tears she refused to let fall. "You didn't have to fight," she said softly. "You only had to believe me." He flinched, the truth of it striking deeper than any accusation. She touched his shoulder briefly, almost in forgiveness, but pulled back before the gesture could linger. "This house is not safe for people like me," she added. "People without names, without shields." He stood then, slowly, the weight of her words settling visibly into his posture. "Then let me build you one," he replied, voice almost breaking. "A name, place. Not out of guilt, but because I can't go on pretending that life is bearable without you in it." That afternoon, the house stirred in ways it had not in months. The servants exchanged glances. Elis remained confined to her rooms, a storm of humiliation and fury burning behind her closed door. She had sensed the tide turning, but not this soon, not so decisively. She paced like a caged animal, calculating her dwindling options. Knew Etienne well enough to know when his mind was made, but she also knew the power of legacy, of scandal, of rumor. She penned 3 letters that day. One to her cousin in Paris, one to a solicitor, and one to a journalist known for discretion. In public defamations, she would not go quietly. If she could not be the Marquise of Balcourt, then she would not allow a seamstress to claim that title without blood on her hands. Meanwhile, Annette spent her days quietly, awaiting clarity rather than action. Etienne visited often, sometimes in silence, sometimes bearing books or questions meant to inspire conversation. They walked in the gardens under the brittle autumn sun, but she remained guarded. She had not forgotten the pain of exile, the humiliation of suspicion. Forgiveness is not forgetting, she reminded herself, is remembering differently. And though his presence warmed her, a corner of her heart remained locked, awaiting proof of permanence in a world that had always favored the transient. Evening, as they sat in the conservatory with dusk gathering around them, Etienne said, "I want you to be more than a guest here. I want you to belong." She looked at him, long and unblinking. "Then let me choose how," she replied. "Let me define what that means. Don't hand me a title like a favor. Let me earn my place, or I'll never believe it's truly mine." He nodded, solemn and sincere. "Start wherever you wish." She chose the library. It was neutral. Ground, sacred with silence and learning. There, she began cataloging the neglected archives. restoring order to chaos, symbolically rebuilding the trust they both had lost. Weeks passed. Gossip stirred, but no scandal erupted. The household slowly adapted to the new rhythm, a lady without jewels, a master no longer mourning. But outside the estate, the world watched, and soon someone else came knocking. One foggy morning, as Annette arranged ledgers on the library desk, a letter arrived. No seal, no return address, only a single folded parchment worn at the edges. She opened it with trembling fingers. Was a name, a date, location in Paris, and beneath it was one sentence written in a hand she hadn't seen in over a decade. There are things you were never told. Her fingers went cold. Her past, it seemed, was not as buried as she believed. And if this was the beginning of its return, would Etienne stand beside her, or would he falter again when truth came dressed in shadows? What secret lies hidden in Annette's forgotten past, and will its revelation bind them forever, or tear them apart for good? The moment hung suspended in the vestibule like the hush before a storm, brittle and breathless, calm but commanding. Cooed off the marble walls as though it had been waiting years to speak that one. It's deniable truth. She's not going anywhere. His gaze remained fixed on Annette, and in that single look, he cast aside every rule of etiquette, every whispered warning of impropriety. Around them, time fractured. Servants froze mid-step, eyes wide and mouths parted, as though the very air had forgotten how to move. Even Madame Charpentier's composed facade wavered, her carefully arranged expression cracking at the edges. She opened her mouth to speak, but Etienne lifted a hand not in violence, but in sovereign finality. Enough, he said. There's been enough cowardice, enough betrayal. Annette's heart pounded against her ribs like a caged bird. Note she had written trembled in her hand. She had prepared for tears, for quiet goodbyes, for solitude. She had not prepared for defiance in her name. As Etienne descended the staircase, each footstep measured, it felt less like an interruption and more like an answer. He stopped before her, not asking, not pleading, simply standing as a man who had already chosen his path. She met his eyes, searching for hesitation and finding none. "Do you understand what this means?" she whispered, voice low. "Meant only for him?" "It means I will not lose you again," he replied. They moved together into the drawing room, away from watching, eyes in frozen silence. There, for the first time in weeks, they were truly alone. He paced slowly before the fire, hands clasped behind his back, a man burdened not by doubt, but by certainty's cost. "They've built their accusations on dust and envy," he said, "but it will hold in court. You and I both know it." Annette sat quietly, her fingers curled around the armrest. "They want to ruin you," she murmured, "and they will if I stay." He turned to her then, eyes blazing. "And if you leave, they win anyway. They silence us. They define the story. I won't let that happen." The next day, the house was no longer quiet. Messages arrived, riders departed, and the estate pulsed with a nervous energy. In the heart of this storm, Etienne stood unshaken. He had summoned his solicitor, drawn up declarations, and refused every suggestion that he distance himself from Annette. "She is not my servant," he stated plainly. "She is not a guest. She is not passing through. She is part of this house, and of me." The staff began to adjust, not because they understood, but because defiance from the master was rare. And rarer still, when spoken so openly. Madame Charpentier, however, did not retreat quietly. She requested an audience. Etienne granted it with the gravitas of a judge granting parole. She entered with her head high, but her voice faltered under his stare. "I acted in the best interest of your legacy," she said, chin trembling beneath its veil of discipline. "No," Etienne replied coldly. "You acted in the interest of order, of silence, of a structure that serves itself and no one else." He dismissed her from her duties, not with anger, but with a kind of mourning. "You have been with this house longer than I have, but I cannot protect what refuses to evolve." Left without another word, her dignity intact, but her influence dissolved. Annette, meanwhile, remained quiet even as the rooms began whispering again in her presence. She walked the halls with a grace born, not of breeding, but of resilience. Every glance, every murmur, was a test she passed without flinching. Her place was not yet accepted, but it was acknowledged, and that, for now, was enough. In the evenings, Etienne joined her in the conservatory. They spoke less of strategy and more of memory, how they had arrived at this moment, and what it might cost them. "Do you regret it?" she asked once. He shook his head. "I regret every day I spent pretending I didn't already choose you." But the outside world had not forgotten them. News of the scandal reached the salons of Paris with ferocious speed. Invitations to Balcourt ceased. Business partners grew distant. Nobles who had once praised Etienne's composure now whispered of madness, of obsession. Annette's name was never spoken aloud, but it was present in every pause, every averted gaze. Etienne began receiving letters from old friends, offering advice wrapped in veiled warnings. "Reconsider while there's still time," one wrote. "Your house cannot stand if you build it on sentiment." Etienne burned that letter without response. One afternoon, as the gray skies threatened rain, a new carriage arrived. From it emerged a woman Annette did not recognize, a countess, younger than Elis, elegant in the precise, predatory way of a noble woman used to attention. She claimed familiarity with Etienne, an old acquaintance. Her tone, however, made clear that she had come to observe, not to reunite. During dinner, her eyes flicked toward Annette again and again, always when she thought no one noticed. Afterward, she cornered Etienne in the gallery. "You've always been impetuous," she said softly, "but never reckless. Is she truly worth all this?" Etienne's reply was a quiet yes. She left the next morning. Annette had witnessed enough of court politics to understand the games being played. Her presence was not the Scandaletian's loyalty to her was. Had he cast her aside, the matter would have faded. But by standing firm, he became the rebel, the cautionary tale. One night, she found him in the library, bent over ledgers and letters. "They want to bleed you dry," she said. "Let them." "Try," he replied, without looking up. "I've rebuilt before." She sat beside him. "Let me be part of it." He turned then, slowly, and smiled, not with relief. Repairing alliances through quiet generosity rather than grand gestures. Intelligence shone not in courtly speeches, but in her precision, her ability to find opportunity in decline. She suggested modest land leases to local farmers, personal letters to families once loyal, and small acts of grace that rebuilt what the aristocracy had scorched. Slowly, Balcourt began to hum with new energy, not glamorous, not ostentatious, but real. Still, the storm gathered. Lee struck next, not with words, but with influence. A magistrate loyal to her family opened a formal inquiry into the estate's management. Under the guise of fiscal concern, they demanded records, receipts, testimonies. It was a weapon, nothing more, meant to exhaust and embarrass. Etienne complied without delay. He handed over documents, invited scrutiny, and dared them to find corruption. They found none. But they planted seeds of suspicion in the press. Annette's name was not mentioned, but phrases like foreign influence, unregistered advisors, and social impropriety filled the columns. She read them without flinching. Etienne was not immune. One morning, he returned from town with a bruised knuckle and a cracked monocle. "An old acquaintance with poor aim," he muttered. Annette said nothing but brought the salve and water. As she cleaned the cut, neither spoke. But her hands trembled, just once, and he kissed her palm to still them. "I'm not afraid," he said. "You should be," she whispered. "Not of them," he answered. "Of losing you." Autumn arrived with sharp winds and falling leaves, but also with a sense of something coalescing. Not resolution, never. That but a path. Etienne began drafting a formal letter to the regional council, offering to step back from certain civic roles. A gesture of appeasement without surrender. Annette advised caution. "If you give ground, they will only want more." He nodded. "Then we choose where to give it and why." One evening, as frost kissed the windows and the fire crackled low, Etienne brought out the locket, the one that had started it all. "You once told me you didn't want to be a secret," he said. Would you still say that now? She took it in her hands, the metal warm from his touch. I don't want to be a mistake, she said softly. He rose then, knelt before her not. In proposal? Not yet, but in acknowledgement. You never were, he whispered. You were the moment I started telling the truth. The next morning, a messenger arrived at Balkert. The seal was unfamiliar. Inside the envelope was not an accusation or warning, but an invitation. A benefactor, anonymous, offering financial backing for the estate's agricultural renewal project. No conditions, no signature. It's just one line in flowing script. Sometimes belief is rewarded. Annette stared at the letter for a long time. Something about the handwriting tugged at memory. Etienne watched her, waiting. Do you recognize it? He asked. I think I might, she said. But if I'm right, then we're not the only ones with secrets. She folded the letter carefully, her mind already racing. Someone from her past, perhaps long buried, had stepped forward. Not to threaten, but to support. The ground shifted again, subtly, but unmistakably. Outside, winter crept closer. Inside, the fire burned brighter, but who had sent the letter on? Why now, after all this time, would someone from Annette's past choose to reveal themselves? The hush that fell over Balkert that afternoon was not of fear, but of reverence. When Etienne stepped forward and pronounced before the entire household, "She is what the world denied me, and I shall not lose her," the air itself seemed to bow in deference. No one dared speak. Madame Charpentier turned ashen. A maid covered her mouth in disbelief. Annette, still halfway between departure and destiny, felt her soul tremble at the weight of such unwavering love. The silence was no longer emptiness, it was testimony in the days that followed. The fire of scandal spread through Bordeaux with a fervor unmatched by truth. In salons and drawing rooms, whispers sprouted like weeds. He must be bewitched, murmured noble women behind their fans. She's a schemer, declared men who had never met her. But beneath those chandeliers, doubt was born of ignorance, not insight. Far from the polished deceit of the capital, among farmers and vintners, a different tale took root. They spoke of a Marquis who defied the chains of tradition, who risked disgrace, not for lust nor pride, but for a woman who had taught him how to be free. Days later, the old chaplain of House Balkert, long retired and nearly forgotten, appeared. At the gates of the estate, he walked slowly, a man in winter, yet his eyes burned like midsummer fire. He requested a private audience with Etienne. No one knows what was said in that room. It's only that when he emerged, he asked that the estate's chapel be prepared for morning mass. He did not speak of marriage or blessing, simply said, some truths deserve to be spoken aloud. What followed was not confrontation, but transformation. Etienne penned a letter to the Montreux estate, formal in structure, but incendiary in tone. He acknowledged the accusations and dismantled them. He declared the testimonies of Madame Charpentier malicious, presented documentation contradicting her claims, and warned that further legal action would be met with public exposure. The Montreux protectors of image above all retreated. Silence was not an admission of guilt, but an act of self-preservation. The court would not be needed. The real verdict had already been rendered by choice. On the evening of that quiet victory, Net and Etienne walked the gallery in silence. They had no need for speeches. The rhythm of their steps, side by side, spoke of something more enduring than words. At the vestibule, he paused, turned to her, and embraced her not as a promise, but as a declaration. It was not fervent, was not desperate. It was the harbor found after the storm, the stillness after the flame. And then the letter came. A courier arrived breathless, bearing a royal summons sealed with gold wax. Etienne read it slowly, his brow unmoving. "We are to appear before the court in Paris," he said, eyes lifting to meet Annette's. "We must defend our union not to law, but to the gaze of those who believe love must be earned by blood." Annette did not flinch. She nodded once. "Then let us go together." Paris greeted them like a queen who has already passed judgment. Gilded staircases, velvet carpets, and eyes that stared too long. The court did not accuse, it observed. Nobles smiled with elegance, but bled judgment from behind painted lips. Yet Etienne stood tall, and Annette did not shrink. They did not beg approval. With quiet dignity, they answered every question, endured every insinuation, and refused to perform. Allies emerged discreet, unnamed, powerful in silence. Friends of Etienne's late father, reformers of quiet influence. Daughters of nobility, who saw in Annette the ghost of their own youth before it was silenced. In the end, there was no fanfare, no applause, but they were not expelled. They were tolerated. And in a court ruled by appearances, that was its own kind of victory. They returned to Valcourt not as heroes, but as survivors. The estate felt different now, older perhaps, or wiser. The silence was no longer loaded with suspicion. The servants no longer watched with wary eyes. Judgments had faded like smoke after thunder. What remained was a house that had withstood its reckoning and found in the ashes something closer. To truth, they never married in ceremony. No white dresses, no golden rings. But they began again not in rebellion, but in grace. Etienne began to rewrite the laws of the land he governed. He divided parcels of his vineyards, not for profit, but for equity. Families who had worked the earth for generations were granted ownership. Women who had always labored in shadows were invited to lead. He didn't speak of charity. He spoke of restoration. In the West Wing, once reserved for foreign dignitaries, a school for embroidery and letters opened its doors. Its first teacher was a woman without title, without surname, but with hands that had known work and a voice that made others listen. Annette did not become Marquise. She did not wear jewels. She wore linen and aprons. But her name was spoken in kitchens and markets, with respect that no title could command. Annette of Valcourt, they called her not because she belonged to the estate, but because it now belonged to her in spirit. Her students learned more than stitching. They learned the poetry of survival, the architecture of dignity. She taught them to write their names boldly, to mend what was broken with both thread and courage. The children of the village ran freely past the gates. Farmers left baskets of fruit at the doorstep. The younger maids greeted her with eyes unlowered. Annette had changed nothing of herself. She had simply become more visible. The posture, the clarity of her step, the calm with which she listened, these were not borrowed from nobility. It had always been hers. Now the world finally acknowledged them. Years passed, not in triumph, but in seasons. The vineyard bloomed, faded, and bloomed again. The old scars of class still showed, but they no longer divided. They reminded that love was not a privilege. That belonging could be forged, not inherited. One afternoon, during harvest, Annette walked through the garden that had once been a symbol of rigid elegance. It had been transformed into a haven of wild beauty. Lavender tumbled over the paths. Sunflowers turned their faces like curious children. Bees hummed without fear. She held her daughter in her arms, a small child wrapped in soft linen, dark hair curling against her temple, hands clenched in dreams. Annette walked slowly, as if the rhythm of her steps could protect this fragile world. Etienne watched her from the doorway, hand braced on the frame, the other crossed over his chest. His eyes followed her as they once had on a dusty road, when she was just a stranger beneath a sunless sky. Only now there was no uncertainty, no shame, only awe. And love they never spoke of forever. They didn't need to. Theirs was not a love that demanded permanence, only presence. It did not chase legend, it built reality. It would be storms. Again, loss, perhaps. But they had already weathered the worst. What remained was choice. Every morning, every breath, every glance that said, "I see you, stay." And under the clear sky, among the vines and the wildflowers, everything finally was, as it should be. If this story stirred something deep within you, if you found pieces of yourself in Annette's quiet strength or Etienne's unwavering devotion, then let it echo a little longer in your heart. Perhaps you felt the weight of unspoken truths, the tenderness of love that asks for nothing but presence, the ache of choosing what is right over what is easy. And if you walked beside them through silence, storms, and uncertain dawns, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so that these stories can continue finding you. Share this tale with someone who believes, or needs to believe, that love is still worth choosing in a world full of noise. Leave us a comment. Tell us what touched you, what made you hold your breath. Save this moment so you can return to it when the world feels too heavy. And when you're ready to begin again, there's another story waiting just one breath away.